He was a man made of contradictions, brilliant and unlearned, worldly and otherworldly, ruthless and devout. His story is an enigma wrapped in the mists of time, spoken of in hushed tones by those who knew him and demonized by those who feared him. He was called the Angel of Darkness, the wolf in sheep's clothing, and the Shadow King. Trained in the art of theological disputation, he understood the need for balance and nuance. No, his early life was a tapestry woven with threads of humility and hard work. This was a man who clawed his way up the ladder of success, whose brilliance and ambition shone brighter than the gilded ceilings of the Vatican. Many a brilliant mind has been lost to the sands of time, but his story was different. It was one that whispered through the ages, carried on the winds of change that swept across Europe. He was not merely a scholar, he was a revolutionary. His writings were not just words on parchment, they were seeds that sprouted the budding humanism that would eventually blossom into the Renaissance. While some popes might shy away from earthly matters, he saw them as an integral part of his calling. This was no man of the cloth who sought solace in the ivory towers of theology. No, he lived his faith, preached it, defended it with a ferocity that shook the foundations of the church. But what truly set him apart was his understanding of power. He didn't shy away from it. He didn't wield it with the arrogance of the nouveau riche. He grasped it, molded it, used it with the finesse of a seasoned statesman. This was a master strategist, a man who knew that God and Caesar were not mutually exclusive. In fact, he believed that they complemented each other, that one could serve the divine without renouncing the earthly. This was a world where religion and politics intertwined in a delicate dance, and he would master the dance with a finesse that surprised even his staunchest supporters, who challenged norms and who left an indelible mark on the world. Let us tell you the story of the man who went from obscurity to becoming one of the most influential figures of his time. Join me as we navigate through the labyrinth of his life, exploring the triumphs and tribulations that shaped one of the most enigmatic popes in history. Together, we'll uncover the layers of this extraordinary individual, separating the myth from reality and discovering the truth behind the enigma. The political intrigues of Renaissance Italy would be the backdrop against which he would make his most significant moves. Alliances and rivalries would test his resolve, but he would emerge from each confrontation more adept, more cunning, more powerful. His critics might scoff, but his detractors would soon learn that it was his very ordinariness that made him so formidable. It was not the opulence of his robes nor the grandeur of his lineage that commanded respect. It was the steel beneath his velvet glove. As his papacy progressed, the whispers about him would only grow louder. Some would hail him as a beacon of reform, others as a symbol of unbending authority. But none could deny the impact he had. In an era of religious fervor and political upheaval, he carved a niche for himself as a leader, a scholar and a warrior. His legacy, much like his papacy, would be a study in contrasts, a testament to the complexity of the man who dared to call himself the successor of Saint Peter. He was Cardinal del Vico, the man who would become Pope. In the heart of 15th century Italy, power was a game of shadows and whispers. Political alliances shifted like sand dunes in a desert windstorm, and at the center of this intricate web of intrigue stood the Medici, ambitious yet unassuming, learned yet cunning. He navigated the treacherous waters of the papal court with a grace that belied his humble origins. His name was remembered, studied, whispered in reverence and fear, for within him burned a will of iron tempered by unwavering faith. His rise to power was meteoric, swift and decisive, leaving his rivals grasping at shadows. Those who had underestimated him now trembled at his ascent. Even the mighty Medici could not ignore the new pope's formidable presence. His papacy would be a period of immense challenges, a tightrope walk between worldly concerns and divine duty. A family whose influence could make or break a papacy. Lorenzo de' Medici, the Magnificent, held court in Florence, his every move a calculated risk in the perilous game of Renaissance politics. Around him, a constellation of rivals, enemies, and opportunists, each believing themselves to be one step ahead. Amidst this turmoil, a young cardinal from Bergamo cut an unlikely figure, but he was no stranger to such complexities. You see, He wasn't born into the lap of luxury. And then there was his unbending faith. So let us delve into the annals of history and unearth the tale of a man who defied the odds. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, stay tuned, because together we can keep these stories alive. The Tiber, swollen and sluggish, swallowed the disgraced Pope in silence. But rivers are strange keepers of memory. What they take, they sometimes give back. And so it was that a few days later, Formosus returned, his bloated body caught in a fisherman's net near the banks. Rumors whispered like smoke that the corpse had floated upstream, defying the current, guided by divine wrath or some darker providence. To the people, it was a sign. To Stephen, it was an omen. And then the voices began. Rome, already fractured by warlords and warring bishops, now trembled with a different fear. Citizens murmured of unnatural stillness around the basilica at night, of the dead Pope walking in their dreams, of the statue of St. Peter weeping silently as if in mourning for his successor. Stories multiplied like flies in summer. Some claimed to see Formosus standing at the gates of the Lateran, robes soaked, hand raised in broken benediction. Others said his fingers had never decayed, that they still pointed at the guilty. Stephen's sermons turned manic. He raved from the pulpit, not about Christ, but about Formosus, his sins, his lies, his poison in the bloodstream of the church. He saw enemies in every shadow, betrayal behind every door. In the depth of night, he would pace the papal chambers, muttering to himself, reliving the trial again and again, as if the verdict had not satisfied something primal within him. Guilt, perhaps, or fear, or madness. And then Rome turned on him. The nobility that once whispered in Stephen's ear now spoke of removing him. The people, once indifferent, now spat his name in the streets. Even the clergy grew silent in his presence, like sheep sensing the sickness in their shepherd. Within months of the Cadaver Synod, Pope Stephen VI was arrested. The guards who dragged him from his chambers found him kneeling, his hands clasped in prayer but not to Christ. Witnesses claimed he was speaking to someone unseen, someone who did not answer. He was thrown into a dungeon beneath the city where the walls were damp with centuries of sorrow. No trial, no ceremony, just a rope, a ceiling beam and silence. Some say he was strangled by his jailers. Others say he hung himself with his own sash, convinced that the spirit of Formosus had come to collect what was owed. But the story did not end there. The corpse of Formosus, recovered once more from the river, was interred again, this time with reverence, with prayers whispered more from fear than from faith. His papacy, though once annulled, was declared valid by his successor. The acts of the Cadaver Synod were reversed. A new pope issued an edict forbidding trials of the dead. It seemed the church, in her shame, sought to bury not just a man, but the memory of her darkest hour. Yet memory, like a body, does not always stay buried. Even now, in hidden vaults and forgotten monasteries, paintings survive strange depictions of a skeletal pope, crowned and robed, pointing a finger at trembling men. Documents, blackened with time, speak of bishops who dreamed of Formosus and awoke with fever. And somewhere in Rome, beneath layers of marble and time, there are whispers that a shrine once stood marked, unblessed, where someone lit candles for the soul of a man who never asked to rise again. The church moved on. New popes came and went, and history polished its armor. But in hushed corners, among scholars and madmen, the Cadaver Synod lives on as a grotesque footnote, a symbol of what power does when it rots from within. And still, some ask, what did Stephen fear so deeply that he had to unearth the dead? What truth did Formosus carry to the grave that could not remain buried? They called it justice, but it felt like ritual of bloodless sacrifice masked in silk and incense. And in the long arc of history, where saints are painted with the same brush as tyrants, that much is clear. He was a man tangled in politics, a diplomat turned pontiff, its skull tilting toward a man shouting accusations at empty eyes. Some works dare to show the severed fingers laid out on velvet cloth like relics. Tourists walk past altars, snap photographs, and admire marble that once echoed with the footsteps of cardinals. And conspirators, few know what happened beneath that ceiling of saints. Fewer still ask, but in some corners on certain nights, a strange chill lingers, not of cold air, but of old eyes watching, of judgment never answered. though they bore no holiness. It was a mirror, showing us what happens when faith becomes theatre, when justice is wielded by those who cannot. Their silence, when the dead are summoned to fight the battles of the living, and so. Formosus rests somewhere beneath stone, beneath time, beneath legend. No longer a man, not quite a myth, just a whisper in the great cathedral of history. But if you ever walk alone past the Lateran at dusk and the bells are quiet, and the windows glint like eyes in fading sun, listen carefully. You might hear the trial begin again, and this time the dead are not the only ones on trial. Others painted Stephen not as a pope, but as a madman drowning in a tide of his own making. But none of them could truly explain the feeling that gripped Rome in those weeks. Not outrage, not grief, but a hollow terror, as if a line had been crossed that should never have been touched, as if desecrating the dead might awaken something darker than memory might open a door that faith could not close. A bishop who once fled Rome under threat and returned only to find his enemies waiting behind altars. He aligned with kings and challenged emperors. His hands, the same hands that blessed the faithful, had signed edicts that shifted the balance of power across Europe. Some say he acted out of survival. Others say it was ambition. But whatever his reasons, the shadows he cast were long and reached into the grave. And what of Stephen? A man not born for power, but thrust into it. A pope by name, a puppet by design. Historians argue he was manipulated by the powerful Spoleto family, whose political ambitions clashed with those Formosus had once favored. Others believe Stephen's own mind had begun to decay, eaten slowly by guilt, or fear, or the unbearable weight of the tiara he wore. His actions were not those of a man seeking justice, they were the trembling screams of one who sees ghosts where others see shadows. The Cadaver Synod became less a memory than a warning. But if one listens closely, beneath the chants and the bells, beneath the chiseled Latin of old church walls, the story still breathes. Formosus had not been a saint. The church tried to bury the synod again and again. Official records were altered. Paintings vanished. Decrees were quietly rescinded, as if truth might be erased like chalk from a slate. But the story survived, passed from monk to monk, whispered in cold scriptoria, copied into forbidden texts with trembling hands, because it was not just about Formosus. It was about power, about what happens when sacred robes are worn by men who fear the dead more than the living. Centuries later, artists and poets would try to capture the image, the corpse in regal vestments, slumped on a golden throne. Even now, in modern Rome, the basilica stands silent, bathed in golden light and holy music. The Cadaver Synod remains one of history's most macabre absurdities. But to call it absurd is to miss the truth. It was not just grotesque.